So, hello again to everybody. I hope you had a good coffee break, and now we go on with an artist talk of Heather Dewey-Hagborg. So, welcome Heather Dewey-Hagborg. She's here with us today, and maybe you have seen her video work, T3511. It's downstairs in the Studio 1. If you didn't see it, you still have the chance to look at it after the talk. But yeah, before we start, Heather starts with a short presentation of her work, with a short introduction. I want to say a few words about her. From the beginning of her artistic practice, of her studies, she did artistic projects on the intersection of art, science, and technology. So she studied information arts in Vermont, interactive telecommunication in New York at the New York University, and then 3 years ago she finished her PhD in electronic arts at the Resale Polytechnic Institute in New York. And she also continued working in education, first as assistant professor of art and technology studies in Chicago, and then assistant professor of biodesign at the New School. So her projects were also shown around the world in various festivals and art spaces like Centre Pompidou, HEC, Haus der elektronischen Künste, MoMA PS1, Victoria and Albert Museum, and Van Abbe Museum, which is not so far away from here. And she also has quite of an impact in the media, so her work was covered widely and was also discussed controversially, for example, in New York Times and Wired, BBC. You could also see a lot of discussions on her work, and I think we will also see a little bit of that right now. She's also writing herself, so check out her essays. You can find them at the New Inquiry. You can find her on her website. They're really, really worth reading. They were published by eFlux and so on. And she's also a speaker. And you also had a lot of residencies, actually, which is also really quite interesting. I would like to hear from all of your experience that you made there. Recently, she came from AI Now Research Institute, where I guess you also worked a lot in laboratories. And what I also want to mention is that she also co-curates and co-founded a platform to promote inclusive and politically engaged art projects. And this platform is Refresh. You should also check out this one. Because, one of her invitees I just saw, Mary Magic. She's also part of Aliens in Green. She wasn't here, but there are also some connections. Just check out Refresh. You will also find really, really interesting art projects there. So I don't think we come to talk about your curatorial approach, but about some of your artwork. So I'm happy to hear your presentation. So I hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. It's wonderful to be here. My first time in Essen, so really thanks for the invitation. My name's Heather Dewey-Hagborg. I'm an artist who works with biotechnology as a medium for critical reflection, in particular on thinking about the interrelationship between biotechnology and society. And my talk, I'll walk through several different art projects and frame it a bit around the work that I have in the show here, which is called T3511. And this project began when I purchased this bottle of saliva online. So I went on the internet and discovered these websites where you can buy cells and DNA and human fluids, and purchased this single human donor's 5 milliliters of saliva. And so you might ask, how did I come to that? How did I end up buying a stranger's saliva online? And that began in about 2012 when I started working with strangers' DNA. So in this project, Stranger Visions, I started picking up things that strangers left in public, like cigarette butts and chewed up gum and hairs. And I took them down the street to the world's first community biology lab that had just opened in New York City called GenSpace. And there I took, over the course of 3 weekends, what they called a crash course in biotechnology, learned how to extract DNA, how to amplify it, how to analyze it, and then put that together with a background that I had in machine learning and looking at surveillance technologies to take computational models of the face and kind of line those up with DNA profiles and use that to generate these algorithmically produced 3D portraits of strangers based on that DNA profile. So here you can see them 3D printed in full color at a life-size human scale of the face. And at this point, I was particularly focused on thinking about this kind of vulnerability of the body, so this messiness that we're shedding these bits and pieces of ourselves in public all the time and not really noticing it, and how this was a new kind of surveillance vulnerability. And as I started working through this project, which was in a sense speculative in 2012, it hadn't become an available service yet. A few years later, it actually was deployed as a service by police. So only a couple of years after I worked on this project, a company called Parabon Nanolabs launched a service that they called DNA Snapshot, where they claim to produce these mugshots of criminals based on DNA left at a crime scene. And at that point, I realized that it wasn't enough in my practice just to point out that there was this technology coming and that there was this kind of potential for surveillance and privacy violation coming out of DNA, but that really the work needed to also deconstruct that technology in its form of exhibition. And so that led to, in the first place, a piece called Radical Love. So this was the first phase of my collaboration with the US whistleblower Chelsea Manning. She was in prison at the time. She was in prison for information she made public through WikiLeaks, exposing the prevalence of torture and civilian deaths in the Afghanistan and Iraq wars. And at the time of her sentencing, she was known as Private Bradley Manning. And then after being sentenced to 35 years in a military prison, she announced her gender transition. And at that point, her face was completely censored. So she was not allowed to be visited, she was not allowed to be photographed, and what that meant was that actually nobody was allowed to see Chelsea Manning. And I was contacted by Paper Magazine in about 2014, and they were conducting an interview with Chelsea through the mail, and they wanted some kind of picture to accompany this interview, but of course they couldn't go there in person to take her picture. And together, both Chelsea and the journalists at Paper had seen my work with strangers and contacted me and asked if I could produce a picture of Chelsea from her DNA, if they were able to kind of smuggle that out of the prison. And so the next time she was getting her mandatory buzz cut in prison, swept up some of the hair clippings and took a couple Q-tips and swabbed the inside of her mouth and sent that to me from the prison. And I went through the process that I went through in Stranger Visions of extracting the DNA, creating a profile from that. But in this case, instead of generating just one picture to show what she might look like based on her DNA, we decided together to put 2 portraits side by side to challenge this kind of determination of sex or gender from DNA. So to put 2 algorithmically differently gendered faces side by side. So you can see on your left would be this so-called neutral face, algorithmically neutral, and on the right, the so-called female face. And so our hope was that in putting these side by side, it would challenge some of these stereotyping assumptions built into DNA profiling, into DNA phenotyping, this attempt to create portraits from DNA. And so this was kind of the first step in complexifying this act of DNA phenotyping, profiling. And we continued to correspond then. I mean, the interesting thing, and I'll come back to, is that I met her through her DNA. And then we began to communicate and to write letters. And when Obama was leaving office, we together wrote this comic book that detailed our collaboration and had this kind of speculative last frame that imagined Obama commuting her sentence and that Chelsea could be freed and actually come and see these portraits in person for the first time. And the amazing thing that happened was we published that comic book, and then literally later that afternoon, Obama commuted her sentence, which is this kind of wonderful, magical incantation that we never thought would come true and that everyone said would never happen. And then a few months later, she was free. And we had an exhibition to celebrate her release from prison. And together, we collaborated on a piece called Probably Chelsea, where I took the same DNA that we used for Radical Love, but instead of putting just 2 portraits on the wall to represent her, we created this entire crowd that showed how many different possible ways you can interpret the same data. So to show how incredibly subjective this act of profiling data actually is. So you can see 30 of course, infinite possible interpretations of the same DNA data, but these are 30 mathematically representative faces that show different readings of that same data. And so you can think of that in a kind of miniature example if you think about genes for eye color. And if you look at genetic readings around eye color, you might say someone has a 60% chance of having blue eyes, but that means that they also have a 30% chance of having brown eyes, a 10% chance of having green eyes. And so if you imagine that you take a physical space and give a place for each of these interpretations instead of just the most probable, then you can begin to create a whole spectrum of different interpretations. So that's what's happening here in a broader way. And so this led me then to T3511, which is the project on display here. In working with Chelsea's DNA and moving from this profiling of strangers, where I would walk around the streets of New York City and I would pick up baggies full of many different people's DNA at the same time and kind of profile them in a panel, which is a lot like what scientists usually do, right? You'll have multiple different samples that you're working with. And moving from that to working with just this one person, sitting there with this person's cells, sitting there with their data and kind of poring over this data and thinking about them all the time and trying to picture them before I ever met them, before I actually even exchanged a single message. In thinking about that months later, I realized that I had this strangely unreciprocal relationship to this person, that it was this very intimate act that I had undergone, and that they, in a way, couldn't ever even know that. And so that led me to thinking more about personal relationships and acts of desire and thinking about intimacy in biotechnology. And so T3511 on display downstairs is kind of the first in a body of work that begins to move more in this direction of thinking about the very personal side of biotechnology. So the single channel version is on view downstairs, but the work is a 4-channel video installation. And what you can see here is that it's meant to kind of put you inside the cell or inside a kind of biobank freezer so that you reflect on your position as also a sample, as a biological commodity. And I'll just play briefly the trailer also, just in case you haven't seen the film. Hopefully that will encourage you to go downstairs and just walk in that room that's right by the entrance. So just a few seconds for that.
A cell is a history.
Oh,
a cell is a home. A cell.
We'll just go back and do it again. Just tell me when you have the sound. Good. Mm-hmm.
A cell is a history.
Yep.
A cell is a home. A cell is a whole. A cell is a cage. A cell is an electric fence, enclosing your legible unknown. To break the cell is to trespass the most intimate of spaces.
So the work is a collaboration with artist and filmmaker Toshiaki Ozawa, and it tells this mostly true story about a biohacker, me, who buys this anonymous donor's saliva online and then takes it and sends it to a direct-to-consumer genetic analysis company, 23andMe. So there's a lot of these kinds of companies that are increasingly available that people are using, like Ancestry.com, 23andMe is a very common one, Family Tree DNA is another. And so I had this kind of moment of insight when I saw the saliva for sale online, how completely trivial it is to just take that and then pour it into one of these kits that are used for profiling. And so this is what the biohacker goes through in the film, pouring this into a kit, sending that off, receiving this person's data, thinking about them, and then the surprise thing that happens is that they contact her. And this kind of strange relationship begins through that, and this kind of obsession forms on the biohacker's part. And so I'll leave you to watch that, and maybe we talk more about it also in the discussion. So what I'm trying to think about here is how biotechnology will impact our lives. I mean, how we also shape biotechnology, of course, in the ways that digital technology already has. So kind of moving from thinking about the impacts of digital technology to thinking about biotechnology in a similar way, giving it a similar emphasis and critical attention. And then I just want to move into a couple other projects as well that are more recent. So right now I have a show up in New York at Friedman Gallery. It's open till August 9th. If you happen to find yourself in New York City, please check it out. It's called At the Temperature of My Body, which is a quote from T3511. And all of these works are relating to thinking about this role of the person in relationship to love and intimacy and desire via biotechnology. And one of the I hope you can see that. It looks very dark for where I'm standing. One of the key works in this installation, so T3511 is there, and that's almost the opening piece of the three. And then we come to Lovesick. And Lovesick is a literal love virus. And so what you can see here, hopefully, on this image are cells that are glowing with an infection. And that's an infection of oxytocin. So I worked as an artist in residence with a company called Integral Molecular in Philadelphia, in the United States. And together we created this literal love virus. So it's a retrovirus. It's basically a shell of HIV that's had the kind of dangerous part of HIV removed, and that mechanism is used instead to take a gene for oxytocin production and red fluorescent protein production and insert those into human cells. And so this is literally something that works. The really interesting thing for me was that I discovered, I was invited to do this residency and kind of went in and hung out in the company to see what they were working on, and was inspired to see kind of all of the work with human cells that related so much to the work I'd been doing in T3511, and then started talking with them, well, what's the intersection of what you're working on and what I've been thinking about in terms of these more intimate aspects of biological science, of molecular biology, of working with viruses. And we just came up together with this idea, could you create a love virus? And if so, what would that look like? And then settled on oxytocin as a subject, because I was particularly interested in aspects of love that are more about coming together. So thinking more of a cuddly love virus rather than one that leaves your heart racing. And so we ended up coming up with this together. And the point with this company is that they just make custom viruses all the time. So for them, it was just kind of standard operating procedure. So they just took the protocol that they use every day in the lab, and instead of working on curing cancer, we put in these oxytocin genes. And so from start to finish, this project took less than a month, which I think I mean, just to dwell on that for a moment, if you think that it's so trivial to create a virus that irreversibly alters human DNA to produce more oxytocin in 1 month, what else could you do? So the project has a kind of utopian twist to it. I mean, it is, I put it there as this idea of an activist intervention, that you could have this biopolitical hacking for love instead of hate, to combat digital alienation, which connects also, I think, to the previous artist talk with Tabitha Razier. But it, in the same breath, invokes, I think, something that's very, very dark and very, very worth thinking more deeply about, which is this act of so easily changing human DNA irreversibly, and what that means for our culture. And that led to thinking about the form of the installation of this work. So of course I'm showing something invisible, basically, a virus. It's incredibly small. And so how do you put that into an exhibition format? How do you get people to think and to feel this virus? And so I started thinking about the narrative world that this virus would inhabit. And that's a project that's an ongoing project for me, is developing almost a science fiction scenario, thinking about the future world that the virus might create. And part of this narrative that I started thinking about was the creation of these glass vials that would hold the virus. So thinking of this kind of underground cottage industry, at least at first, that produces the virus, and then that they would create these glass vials like with test tube type glass, that are a bit like cyanide capsules. So these new rituals that would emerge, new kind of bio-rituals around kind of breaking open this oxytocin-shaped bottle, and then consuming the virus, and then together singing the letters of the amino acids in oxytocin. And here you can see these vials on display. So here, there's 2 in this exhibition in New York. There's 2 vitrines that contain 10 different states of the oxytocin molecule. And here you can see what's akin to a kind of microscope view of bright field microscopy, so a white light lighting up the sculptures. And then here you can see the sculptures glowing as the cells glow red under the bright blue light of the microscope. The virus in the glass also glows under bright blue light. And so the virus is actually in there in a deactivated form, but the cells and the virus itself are literally present in these glass tubes. And here you can see a bit more context from the installation. So these are 2 of the vitrines side by side. And then there's 2 videos that are up high that show microscope views, kind of panning over the stage of the microscope, that are meant to evoke a kind of chapel-like feeling. And then you can hear the singing of these amino acids playing within this chapel-like space. And then leading you into that kind of ritual area are prints of the cells showing their red fluorescent protein, so showing the cells both before infection and also after infection. So this glowing red is how you know that it works. Basically, it's a reporter for the red fluorescent protein, for of the red fluorescent protein for the oxytocin. And then finally, the last kind of image that's on display there are images that reflect the creation of scientific knowledge also, so you can see the laboratory reflected in the glass of the eyepiece of the microscope, for example, in this image here. And then the last work that I want to share with you today is called Spirit Molecule, and this is an ongoing collaboration with the artist and psychoactive botanist Philip Andrew Lewis. So we met when we were both giving artist talks a couple years ago, and we started talking about the intersection of our practices. What would it look like for a collaboration to take place between the 2 of us? And we started thinking through what became this ongoing body of research called Spirit Molecule, where we are creating genetic memorial plants. So we're taking legal psychoactive plants and inserting the DNA of a loved one into that plant, with the idea that you could grow that plant, of course, create a relationship to that plant, but then also consume that plant and consume your loved one's DNA after they pass away, as this kind of journey of intimacy and as a biotechnological form of grief or mourning. And here you can see an installation view from the spirit molecule iteration in New York City. It's the third iteration of this project. Each one is kind of bringing us closer to this goal of creating this literal living genetic memorial. In this case, you can see these petri dishes on the table are stages in the laboratory process that's being enacted in the gallery. So there's a molecular biologist who comes in and performs the genetic transformation live in the gallery. And you can see passion flowers and morning glory plants awaiting transformation. And we're working with the DNA of Philip's grandmother in this project. And it is a very personal project for me also. I've lost 2 people this year who are very close to me. And it is, it's something that I find very meaningful and that I mean in complete earnestness. I mean, it of course evokes ethical questions, but I think also points to ways in which biotechnology can be used really symbolically, but also in a very personal and transformational sense. Which is to say, it's something I would actually want. It's not just something that I put out there as an idea. So there's another view of the installation. And then here you can see our first sprout with Philip's grandmother in it, beginning first with the tobacco plant, because the tobacco is one of the workhorse plants of molecular biology. It's very easy to transform. So we're beginning with that and then moving on over the course of the gallery installation to hopefully also insert into Morning Glory. And I think I'll end by showing you just a minute of the video that Philip and I created, which shares the narrative around spirit molecule with you. It's at least one narrative path into thinking about this project. Leave it with that, and then maybe we transition into conversation.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much, Heather, for sharing, showing us your work and update us on your latest works. Are there any questions already from the public? Yes.
Sorry, I'm a bit fast. Thank you for the presentation. I would like to ask about this last project. If I understand well, the DNA from the person is used in order to be included in the DNA of the plant. how does that work? Like, at which level? If you can speak a little bit more
Sure.
in detail how that is done.
Absolutely, yeah. So it's not the person's whole DNA. So we are taking a small piece of the mitochondrial DNA, and that is because that is passed down matrilinearly. So that is a kind of, it's passed down from mother to child, great-great-great-grandmother, and so on. It's also often used for tracing ancestry. And so it's this 400 base pair chunk from this matrilineal mitochondrial DNA that's then inserted into the plant's genome. And
In a seed of the plant, or in
well, into the plant, which then goes to seed. Exactly. And then there's a kind of process of selection of seeing which of the seeds contain the DNA, and then you can grow the plant again from those. And nobody knows how many generations that that bit of DNA that we've inserted will be contained in the plant's genome. It has no function for the plant, so it's of no benefit for the plant to keep it there. So it's totally possible that after X number of generations, it's no longer there. But we don't know that yet.
Thank you.
Are there any more questions? Jens?
Hi, thanks. I'm very interested in the way that you are choosing different instances of biomediality in your work. For example, you started off with a kind of deconstruction of the over-ontologization that happens through DNA, and then moved to other kind of agencies such as viruses. There are very few artists only have been working literally and materially with viruses, Tani Duff, for example, while they're very often blended out, right? They are screened out as tools, very often for microbiological processes, but they're not addressed as such. So I would like to ask a question about media adequacy, because all your work that is more recent goes in the direction of relational agents, and the other ones, the DNA works, are a lot more about ontologization. So it's very interesting to see precisely the virus, even used by artists. Most often in media art, it was the metaphor of a virus transposed to electronic media. And what does it mean for you to actually rematerialize the very agency in a material sense of the virus? Because there have been all these confusions, and we have this case from '89. I don't know if you remember this case in '89 of the Joseph Popp scandal, of a zoologist sending out a virus precisely to conferences that would infect with a diskette the information made available to have safer sex. So there was a computer virus being used in order to prevent the spreading of real AIDS. So there was this coupling of real world problems on the material biological level, which was compromised by a hacker who compromised this with a virus on an electronic level. So media adequacy, I think, is a very important aspect, and I would like you to elaborate a little bit on that. Thank you.
I think that's a really insightful observation. I would say in terms of my process, it's a bit serendipitous and subjective. So basically, I've followed the path that my work has taken me on as an active reflection on the works that came before. So each of the projects that I share in a way meditates on the earlier work that I've done. I think it's really clear to see that when you see kind of Stranger Visions, one portrait, and then Chelsea Manning, 30 portraits, it's a clear relationship. And then the way that that continues might become maybe more internal to me, how that then moves on. But through T3511, then T3511 kind of straddles these two things. So on the one side, it is also about the vulnerability of biomaterials. So literally buying someone online and finding them and the implications of that. But then it is also showing this new way that one can fall in love with the other person. And so it kind of bridges then into this later work that is more specifically thinking about human relationships to each other via these biological agents. And then in terms of the virus, actually I had no idea that I would work with a virus until I walked into this virology lab and saw how they worked and kind of related materially to their practices and started working and just talking with them and asking them about how they work and then trying to relate that to my own research interests and kind of personal reflections on digital culture, which is, again, I mean, really similar, I think, to what Tabitha was talking about in the earlier talk, trying to deal with this alienation and the rise of right-wing hate that's become kind of impossible to ignore, and then thinking how does biotechnology play as a medium into these social relationships, or how might it in the future? And yeah, so I guess I would just say that it has been a very serendipitous process, and I'm kind of following where the medium takes me.
Yeah, you were giving the example of the stranger visions and how a couple of years later this was actually being used. Do you sometimes worry about this? Because of course you depart from a critical perspective, but I can imagine that some of your work, like producing this kind of virus, there is also like could be like a commercial interest in doing these things, or maybe this is already happening, or how do you stand?
So in all of the work that I share, I'm sharing with the public work that's already happening behind closed doors. So in the case of Stranger Visions, that work was really very early on. I saw preliminary research that was being published around phenotyping, around trying to characterize visible traits from DNA in its application in forensics. So there was this handful of papers coming out over years pointing in that direction. So I kind of put the dots together, also with looking at what was happening with data and machine learning and facial recognition, and sort of it became clear that this was coming very soon. Although I didn't think it would come so soon. With the viruses, that is totally standard. I mean, it's been this kind of gene therapy process that's been a laboratory staple for decades. So it's not, I mean, there's literally nothing new about it. Maybe the only thing that's new is that it becomes so easy to, for example, order genes and to put the thing together. And the company that I worked with has been refining that process for a long time, also refining ways of doing it more safely, doing it more cheaply. So the lab that I worked in was not like a high security lab in any sense. I mean, it was a pretty basic lab, not different really from one you might have in an advanced high school class, where you might do some cell culturing. So there are some advances that have taken place there. But I think it's meant, I mean, it is meant to make you feel, but it's also meant to make you aware that this is already there. I mean, this thing that feels like the future is actually the past. And we're really far behind in having any kind of social conversations about what will come of that.
I kind of want to continue on a similar question, and on this putting DNA of your loved ones into a plant, we had many discussions already. There's a few other work out there. Mm-hmm. When it is a potentially completely commercial hoax to make a lot of money with love and death, and I don't want to get so much your personal kind of experience with it, but I think there is already companies selling, you can burn the ashes and make a ring, and you can whatever, put it in a cat or something, and it's huge business. And you did say that it's become a very kind of something you want. Do you think everybody would want this, and we should really start putting all this human DNA in trees and grow them everywhere?
I have no idea if everyone would want this. So my practice comes from a subjective place. So I can tell you what I want, but you would have to tell me what you want. And I'm totally open to hearing what you want or don't want. I think there is certainly a tradition in the arts of intersecting human DNA with non-human DNA, plants included. So it certainly builds on that history and practice, and in addition to the history and practice within molecular biology, which goes back for a very long time. It does also connect, however, to burgeoning research in psychedelics. So there's been a lot of interest in revisiting what have been, for quite a long time, illegal plants and looking at the medicinal properties of those plants. And these are also plants that are used in grief in a spiritual sense. So I think bringing those two things together is novel. And yeah, I mean, I think it is something that my collaborator and I both felt was something we were genuinely interested in addition to hoping that it provides a frame for the public to think more about that and to think about how they might relate to that. But I would like to keep that open enough that the viewer can come and project their own fears and desires onto it, and then you can tell me what you think.
I just would like to continue on this thought, because I was trying to imagine the potential of this, that it somehow, I understood it as a possibility to give to people who have maybe no belief or there is no life after, but there is this concrete emotion fact of the loss of someone produce things, let's call it like this, that one needs to put somewhere or doesn't necessarily know how to deal with. And I was thinking there's an interesting sort of a construction of a possible imagination of a non-believer to believe in something that, like you say, well, anyway, this gene is there. Who knows? Or like it, as far as we can know or observe, it doesn't do anything visible or hearable or smellable or touchable. Like so, in this realm. Yeah, maybe I would be curious to hear from because you talk from this subjective, so I'm allowed to ask you how do you connect to this possibility? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So both Lovesick and Spirit Molecule, I think, begin to move in this direction of thinking of biotechnology as a religion, and what. In particular, I mean, that's a very kind of general thing to think of, and not particularly insightful, because the discussion of science is like a religion is well known. But what particular ritualistic or spiritual practices might develop in the future? That's sort of the part of that I find interesting. And so both of those projects begin to point in that direction of thinking about that, or what kind of cults might come out of biotechnology is another way of thinking of it. And so I am developing that in future work also, maybe a little bit more advanced in terms of thinking through more narratively, but also experientially, ways that you can feel biotechnology as this overwhelming spiritual experience. What might that look like, or what might that feel like? So that's definitely something I'm interested in thinking more about actively.
I would like to come back to the question of controversy versus or with responsibility, because you said that often you also take on topics and you work on topics that are not discussed in public, and you do this works, and obviously your work has a lot of impact, or they are covered by a lot of media, but they are also, they deal with controversy, but they are also in themselves controversial. So what does it mean, like controversy in your work? And did you also already encounter ethical or legal limits that you wouldn't like to cross?
Yes, definitely. So that I had kind of a crash course in that in 2012 when I was working on Stranger Visions, and suddenly the Wall Street Journal showed up at this exhibition I was having, and after that it was like this media, kind of, in a way it felt like a harassment of constant deluge of media asking me for interviews and so on. And I, at the time, felt like I was still just in kind of a work in progress stage with the work. I hadn't even shown it at the time in a way that I thought was finished. And then what I realized in a way was that the media completed that work. So it created the narrative, the many different narratives that were spun then out from that, whether it was about surveillance or 3D printing or forensics. So this kind of multitude of narratives that got spun from that then informed my own thinking about the piece and my own understanding of how these technologies are perceived by the public and how the media plays a role in that. So that became a whole complex thing. In working in terms of the ethical side and the legal side, so in that project, it is a legally gray area in terms of like picking up or working with strangers' DNA, especially if they haven't actively consented to having that used. So there is a question of whether that would be punishable, for example, by like a small fine in the context of New York State, for example. And then my own ethical line that I drew for that project was to not look at disease risk. So that was, for me, it was kind of, okay, I'm going to look at things that might give clues as to what someone might look like, but I'm not going to look at like risks of cancer and things like that. I think each project raises its own legal and ethical questions, and every time I have to try to think through what my own boundaries are and how much it's worth it to take some kind of risk on myself to bring attention to issues and what that really means. And so it's a very active process that I'm engaging in all the time, weighing the pros and the cons of that, and hopefully coming out the other end making ethical decisions.
Yeah, and maybe because you were also talking about narratives, no, taken up by the media. What do you think? How much power? Because I kind of ask this every artist that I meet here. What kind of power do you think do those technological narratives have? Because I'm also referring to the DNA portraits, no, that were kind of taken up as a service by, I think, Chinese company, no, for the local police, for the police officials, and that was, I think, like a couple of years, no, after you also talked about this in your presentation. So what do you think, how much faculty do these technological stories have, and what role does this play also in your work?
I think that they are very powerful. What I felt with Stranger Visions was a bit that, I say the media completed the piece. Also, another way of thinking of that is that I was used by the media and wasn't really very savvy about it. And so definitely, since that time, I try to take more agency with how my work is described, with how I perform,
I mean, seeing the appearance on media as a performance and thinking really more specifically about what I want to say. I mean, in as much agency as you can ever have when you are the content, basically. But trying to use that more as a platform. But I think that it is very powerful. And thinking of Chelsea, I think that the work played a part in bringing her visibility. I mean, so for example, these 2 portraits that I showed, they premiered at the World Economic Forum in this moment also where she was really forgotten about. I mean, she was really sitting there in prison and nobody was reporting on it anymore. And I think it was meaningful to put that, to intervene in this space and put these images there, and then the kind of media that came out of that, I think it can play an important role. And certainly it's always playing a role in how we see the world that we live in and what we think our position in that world is and how much we feel that we have agency, or what we think the possibilities are going forward are certainly framed by these media narratives. So I think it's really important to try to put other stuff out there as much as possible that opens up these avenues of potential.
So, are there any more questions? Because we already heading towards the end, so.
Maybe on that side.
Yes. Okay, then I think it's time for lunch now. Thank you very much, Heather, for being here, and also, sure, if you want to approach her, ask more questions. Or yeah, maybe we all have lunch together now. So yeah, thank you for being here, that you came, and thank you again. And see you again, I think, Fabian, at 2:30 with Luisa. Okay, bye.